Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today, we're here to talk about pay transparency, especially in light of new regulation. I'm Nikki Adamson. I'm the CEO and founder of Hustle Hunters. We help early stage startups build out their talent brands, attract great talent, and be able to build out that early stage foundational hiring function. We do that as mostly recruiters, but also coaches helping us get there. And today, we're here to talk about pay transparency. What does it mean to put our salary ranges on our job descriptions? And beyond that, what does that mean internally for pay bands? It goes so far. We wanted to make this no nonsense, 30-minute punchy conversation to help everyone get ready to be able to stay in compliance and at the end of the day, make this pretty important step towards pay equity. Pay transparency is definitely one of the many steps on that path. And I'm excited to be joined today by, I guess I can call you a friend, colleague, an expert in this space in that, Rocío Garza Tisdell. She has been working at Brooklyn Data for a while, which is another company that's been really at the forefront of making sure that pay equity and pay transparency and there's minimizing asymmetric information is at the core of what they do as a talent team. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, to get started, I've just been very intrigued by everything that Brooklyn Data has done in terms of pay, and I've worked with you on the candidate side of things. I'd love to hear a little bit from you, like, why did you join their team? What was the experience for you there as a candidate, specifically when we think about transparency?
Yeah, I guess the backtrack. So when I applied for the role at Brooklyn Data, I was looking in mid-late 2021 for my next role. And before the role that I eventually applied to and secured with the team was posted, I actually saw Kelly Dore, our head of people, had posted a role for another team member for an analyst role or something like that. She had listed just upfront the full kind of like benefits compensation package, including ranges. And on top of that listed, this is what you can expect step by step from our recruiting process. And that intrigued me. And so when a role with working with Kelly appeared, I couldn't help but apply to it. And then what I have to say, I was delightfully surprised to kind of experience that through the lens of an actual candidate and really seeing they were true to their word. I knew what to expect every step of the way. So even if there were, some periods of silence, and for any candidate, more than a couple of days can feel painful. I knew, what I might expect, when I might feel comfortable just giving them the nudge without feeling like I was bothering their team. And in the end, while I had other, stakes in the fire, so to speak, I kept finding myself going back to them and talking with them and speaking to my executive coach at the time to say, like, I think they're the one kind of thing. And so I was just really excited to join their team. And every day has just been a delight in terms of working with everyone and really collaborating across all the things that we do in People Ops, just as it was kind of described to me in that process. So yeah, that's really how I got there in September 2021, and I continue to be there today.
Oh, very exciting. I love hearing that story that like you got to see it as a candidate in that work to kind of continue to enhance those processes and work with folks that built that out. Can you share a little bit around pay transparency as kind of a philosophy and like why that is important just to you as a person, maybe to your organization or broader?
Yeah, sure. So on a personal level, I have found that the pieces of equity, inclusion, and all of those good things have been a constant throughout my career. And for me personally, again, like that's where I think as much information as you can share, the better. As a candidate, it's obviously really great in that I know what I'm looking at. I'm not wasting my time. Sometimes I've seen job postings. I'm like, wow, I had no idea that these types of roles could pay this much. From an employer perspective, and again, being where I am right now, like there are kind of three main factors that I consider, and that one, again, inclusion is one of our values. So promoting general fairness and equity across the team. A second piece of that is educating our team members on what their pay looks like, what they need to do to reach the next step of their careers. We do use a framework, a career framework, where you can see level by level what skills and competencies are needed and what the pay attached to the next level looks like. And also for them to be able to use shared language and kind of saying like, hey, I actually think I might be misleveled. Can we have that conversation? So it's actually giving us a lot of tools to facilitate those conversations within the team. And then as a result of the first and the second, really making sure we're building trust and improving retention within our team. As anyone knows, I'm sure as you know, as a recruiter, a recruiting company, attrition is expensive. And the more we can do to make sure everybody feels good about our practices around compensation, the better for everyone, really.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. So thank you to everyone who's joining in live, listening. Please get your questions in the chat, the comments on LinkedIn. We're excited, as well as folks that are listening later. We're still here. We're just people. We love talking about these topics. So we're happy to answer your questions, and we'll provide our contact information later as well. So for me, when I think through where this, why this is important to me, is I see so often we get to especially in early stage companies where there's less structure, we get to that salary discussion, and it, like, depending on who's there, and people always ask and things change. And, if we don't have that built in early, there's going to be bias included there, right? There's unquestionable data that shows not only, I think historically we talked about how women, didn't negotiate as much, and realized like actually women ask for raises and negotiate the same rate as men, but are given it significantly less often, right? We know that white men specifically are given offered larger starting salaries, offered more on those fronts. So if we know that there's going to be bias, right? Especially in the tech industry, the startup scene. It looks the way it looks, not accidentally, and we need to be pretty actively going around that. So from us, we talk a lot about what's the bottom end of the range and what's the top end of the range and what's the difference before we even have a candidate in play, right? Let's look at some profiles side by side to get there. And then we hear this from candidates all the time. And there's lots of objections that I've heard from folks. It's scary, right? To take the thing money we've learned is like kind of not supposed to be talking about and put it right on the internet for all to see on a post that you're sharing widely. But at the end of the day, I work for money. I don't know about you, Rocío. At the end of the day, most of us are doing that. And then when we think about diversity and diversifying our candidate pipelines, the more we're able to show that, knowing that specifically wealth in the US, white families have more generational wealth than families of any other racial background. And that, when we look at that wholeheartedly, we recognize, oftentimes folks, candidates of color, are supporting other family members, right? Have different types of debt, different relationships with debt. Many candidates have relationships with debt, especially student debt. And, might think that tech salaries are great, but at the end of the day, we do work for money, and it's important to know what that's going to be before we jump into that conversation. Awesome. Well, I kind of want to shift the conversation over to like who's impacted now. So I know there's all sorts of new legislation. I know you've been deep in the text. I've been deep in the text. We had a nice chat last week around like the legalese that we were noticing. But are there any trends, while I pull up some charts to show kind of who's impacted, are there any trends that you're noticing here?
Yeah. And I'll wait for you to.
Yeah. All right. Should have it ready. Sure. Yeah.
Um,
Aha, we're here.
yeah. Yeah, I think some of the things that I'm seeing that are interesting is, well, I guess from the get-go, I think one thing that has been really important in the pay transparency kind of movement, with California's entry into that in particular is obviously we are the largest state by population, and I say we because I live in California. And for companies, especially those who are entertaining workers who are remote or hybrid, we are a big set of that pool. And so I think it's interesting to see where employers are starting to think about, okay, well, I'm posting, we're based in some other state perhaps that doesn't really require this, but now we need to post that. Some things that I've seen that Colorado, our states that were hiring in Colorado are already doing. We're being very specific of like, oh, for candidates in Colorado, this is what this looks like. And now that I'm seeing some of those companies recruiting also in New York and California, they're putting kind of distinctive ranges for those different states. Conversely, I see companies just saying like, here's the pay range for wherever you're located in the US. And again, that's going to go to some of our later conversation, I know, about what is your pay philosophy and how you're going to approach that. Yeah, so I think those are some of the initial things that start to jump out at me as the pay transparency start to come out.
Yeah, I noticed, I think, California or Colorado was early here, but I think folks felt like there's plenty of talented people in Colorado, but it was maybe okay to wait on. But now, like by the end of 2023, so by September, roughly 1 in 4 workers will be covered by state or local laws that require pay transparency. Right now, it's about 1/6 of employees. The big one is going to be New York State, goes into effect in September. And we find that I think there's fear sometimes that maybe more candidates aren't going to apply, but we found that 70% of candidates are more likely to apply when they see how much money they're going to make. Again, shocking, but this, I think California, and then also looking at Washington, has a pretty comprehensive set of legislation here. And the thing that I really noted in Washington's was it shares that if you do business in the state of Washington, they're pretty broad on what that means. If you have 1 employee in Washington, and then the kicker for most companies who are hiring with options of remote or hybrid is that if the role could be remotely done by an employee who happens to reside in Washington, then you need to be compliant, right? That this legislation covers you. So kind of the option is to say this role cannot be done by someone in Washington explicitly, or to include the full salary range and the full benefits. So I wanted to share a little bit about what this full benefits piece is, because this is newer and there's a lot of guidance in their legislation in terms of what is full benefits. I looked through some postings that I've done and realized that while I've always included the compensation range with a lower and upper limit, thinking about what is commission, what does that bonus look like, haven't always included things like sick time. And their legislation says that you need to include sick time allotment. And the state regulation is 1 hour per 40 hours, as well as paid holidays. And other coverage. So a lot of this is pretty low hanging fruit. Most of us know our sick policy, know our PTO allotment. It's a really great opportunity to get it out into the world because most employees are looking for these things, and knowing that other companies are going to start doing that. It's exciting that, we get to share that with the world. Don't worry about, droning on with a really lengthy job description. Candidates want all these details.
Yeah. Yeah. I think something I've seen certainly working at Brooklyn too is that I don't know how many times candidates have messaged us to be like, this is so wonderful that you put this up front, even in their initial application when they're in those first conversations with the team. And yeah, it doesn't surprise me that more and more people want to apply to companies that are doing that like we are.
Yeah, we get a lot of messages back from candidates that say, we don't normally speak to recruiters. I don't normally respond to recruiters, but you told me everything I need to know. Now I trust you enough, right? And I think with startups, most employees, they want to be trusted in their role. And it's a great opportunity as hiring teams to show that we're going to trust you from the get-go, right? We're not going to hold back. We're going to be transparent about information. And we want everyone to have the information that's available to them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think another layer of that trust too is just instilling confidence in what you're doing as a startup. It's like, oh, you've got your act together. You know what your numbers are. I feel confident in joining something that may otherwise look, less stable than, an enterprise company that's been around for a while.
Totally. So here's a few other pieces that I learned that, alternate disclosure, right? A bunch of states also have writing on the books that says you need to share the range upon request. And something that I noticed specifically was that a lot of these legislations are newer and had been directly replacing old legislation that allowed employers to require employees to not share pay ranges and not have to talk about pay ranges internally with employees and not necessarily in the job process. So it's a really major shift all across the board in terms of what that transparency looks like.
Yeah. And I love seeing that this continues to grow. And like, again, I think we both are very aware with the addition of New York and California to this, it's only going to continue spreading across the country.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, jump in if you have questions about these pieces. Neither of us are lawyers, and we're not necessarily compensation specialists per se. So obviously talk to your legal counsel as you're getting deep into the text. But in general, we found it was helpful to have a chart that helped us understand exactly what was there, as well as looking at what is that best practice. So really, it's what the state of Washington has of showcasing the bottom end of the range, the top end of the range, and then talking about your full range of benefits as detailed and prescriptive and specific as you can be. Especially, I would recommend folks looking at unlimited PTO. What does that mean for your team? What is the average that people take? Is there a minimum? My team, we have a minimum. We have a minimum 3 weeks within our unlimited PTO. So that means folks can take more than 3 weeks. But if you're let go or leave, whatever, you're going to get paid out the rest of whatever that 3 weeks was. And also, it just kind of sets the standard that my employees who might be on this, I think, hey, Erica, I will nudge you very gently or aggressively out the door if you haven't taken your time to make sure that we're here for the marathon, not the sprint.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I know, so our team grew from 40 to just over 100 in the past calendar year. And as we've scaled, that's one of those pieces that we want to pay greater attention to is making sure we're nudging managers and team members to say, hey, I noticed you haven't taken time off in a while, and making sure people are taking care of themselves, because again, we want everyone to be productive and not supporting that is expensive for a company.
Totally. And I also want to take a minute. Now we've kind of discussed a little bit about like pay bands and getting that on the job description. Again, I think that's going to be the forcing function, right? This new legislation. But now we're looking at people leaders who maybe are at a company that this hasn't been a main focus for. So now you're a people leader, you've been managing maybe in office, maybe hybrid in the midst of a global pandemic, in the midst of, hiring freezes and hiring pushes of, I think, to last summer, right? When everyone was in a hiring spree. So you're kind of on this roller coaster, and now looking at pay transparency probably feels pretty daunting, right? So we're looking at this saying, we don't have internal pay bands, and it's really challenging to do that on the fly. Okay, if I post this role online, before getting our house in order internally, some folks who are also in that same position might recognize that the new person's going to make more than them. Like, it gets really tricky, right? This isn't a quick hit that you just copy and paste on your job description template, and now you get to check this box. It really opens up a whole can of worms, as we now need to rework our pay bands, especially if there's some legacy hires in there that don't match. Maybe not wanting competitors to know what we pay, or how wide can we list the bands, like what's best practice. So there's so many different pieces beyond here. Obviously, like getting the final numbers on the salary are kind of like the bow, right? After we've done all the work with the rest of the present. So yeah, I kind of want to tip that over to you, Rocío. Like, what have you seen? What are some of those different pieces that might be resources for folks starting to think this? And then we'll get a little bit more into Brooklyn data. Like, what have you done? And that this wasn't a reactionary decision. Y'all have been thinking pretty holistically about this for years.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think any quick search on, pay transparency guidance, support and things like that on, your general browser search is going to turn up a number of resources. I often, and I say this having worked in other compliance spaces in the past, start with the legislation. A lot of the states themselves offer, very much robust resources. You pointed out some of the things for Washington State. California's Equal Pay Act, which actually has been in place prior to the pay transparency piece, is a really great resource to consider what might be best practice, regardless, again, of what state in which you might be operating. But of course, double check what might apply to you locally. I think one of the big pieces that I hear from other companies or people in their people teams might be, oh, well, morale's going to get slammed if people start to see where we have discrepancies. Um, to me, that's even more justification to really clean up what you're doing on the compensation end. Being able to reconcile years of when there might be some rogue salary practices. I think there's a bit of hubris from the company perspective to think just because you haven't posted them transparently that nobody knows about them. I've certainly been in a situation where I learned that I was making significantly less than peers in similar positions, and like that in and of itself is demoralizing. And people talk, and I think that's what it comes down to. And people also talk to others in other companies to say, oh wow, that's what that looks like here. So you're not really doing yourself any favors by kind of shrouding your pay process. And I think even being able to kind of own, we grew really fast, we made some decisions, they weren't always aligned, we're trying to do better, I think can actually build a lot of confidence and trust in ways that you may not expect within your company.
Yeah, for sure. I still get upset when I talk about times that I feel like I've been paid less. And we had an internal chat yesterday or recently, and every single one of us had an experience that we knew this happened in our careers, right? And it was really negative. Even though we'd had tons of positive experiences with that organization, it really colored my looking back on time there. Great. Thanks for sharing that. Well, specifically at Brooklyn Data, can you tell us philosophically, kind of high level, what are some of the things that you've noticed either now or kind of you saw that were put into place from the beginning that helped set the table for y'all to be a leader in this field?
Yeah, and I do want to speak to the career framework in particular, because it's something that I myself have been spending a great deal of time on in the last several months since I returned from mat leave, and a large part of what's driving what we do and how we have the conversation again is that framework to say you're in a role, you're at this level, we know this is your pay, and that way again everyone knows if I move up to the next level, this is what my pay is going to look like now. So we've been pretty transparent since before I even joined, to say here are the pay ranges. We do localize by geography, so someone in the UK isn't making the same as the US, isn't making the same as our team members in El Salvador or Nigeria, and we do that for a number of reasons. And again, it comes down to equity and the kind of power of the dollar. And to say, what I can get for, a 20 in the US is not going to get me the same as what I might get in another country. And so really wanting to make sure we're equitable in that regard. Our company really focuses on aligning what we're doing in terms of compensation with our mission. And by that, I mean business goals as well as our values. So two of our big values I mentioned are inclusion and transparency. And we are a data company, so we are looking at a variety of sources to benchmark, what's competitive among data consultancies. Some of those include PayScale, Salary.com, ERI, and Numbeo. I know that our CEO and our accounting team have kind of come up with a formula and spreadsheet of here's how we're looking at this again across geographies. I know a lot of companies will aim for mid-market, so say 50th percentile. We aim for above that. And again, it's going to be a blend of understanding your market, how competitive you're able to be versus how competitive you can be considering your cash flows. And I was been impressed with that on Brooklyn's end, in that we are a bootstrapped, in that we aren't seeking outside funding, or we haven't historically for our company. And so the fact that we have aimed for mid-market to begin with, I think is, again, it instills confidence in me as a team member to say okay, we feel like we're good about what we're doing. We feel good about our financial health. And again, the increases themselves are tied to leveling within a role. So again, there aren't surprises. I know if I'm an analytics engineer too, that any other analytics engineer too is also making the same.
So, awesome. Yeah, I see so many job descriptions that say competitive compensation, right? Which has kind of become almost a funny phrase, because what does that mean? And so often I talk to candidates and they say if I see that, I kind of assume they're not paying well. I assume it's a startup that pays really poorly. And I talk to hiring teams and they say, well, I'm worried that somebody who wants more money might assume that we don't pay enough, or they might be scared off because our numbers are low. Whereas in reality, like, your numbers are your numbers, right? Your budget is your budget, and there might be a small amount of wiggle room, but at the end of the day, most candidates, if they don't see anything, are actually assuming it's lower than it probably is, and might be turned from that. It's just something that I've seen in talking to candidates. So it's funny that the same phrase can be seen so differently depending on which side of the equation that we're on. So yeah, I love hearing kind of that philosophy, and that's something I'm finding that is really the number one piece, right? Is building out, like, if you're kind of just getting started today on what does this look like in your organization, understand what is your pay philosophy? What has it been? Is that what you want? How does that tie into your values? Sounds like that's kind of a core piece. Anything else that kind of comes up as like next secondary?
Yeah, I think, well, it's not something that has had to happen with our company, because again, it's something that we've been doing as far as I can tell. But definitely, making sure that if you haven't had this in place and you are aware of, big discrepancies and where pay may fall, really taking a moment to audit and figure out, on payroll, where are there gaps? Why do these gaps exist? How can we resolve them? And again, it's a way to prepare yourself for, okay, we know we need to post this range. This is what it's going to look like. How can we address it? What was our rationale then? What's our rationale now? And what are we going to do? Correct it. Again, to avoid, disgruntlement among your teams, but certainly in the extreme end litigation, I think it's all about, like, really just showing your team that you are committed to the process and creating that fairness, and not necessarily solely to protect yourself, but certainly protecting yourself legally.
Awesome. That's great. And then for teams that are ready to do this lift, can you share a little bit of, like, what type of lift you see for a team that's realizing they really need to move towards compliance here? Again, we're all about real talk. I think this is a pretty big lift, so I'd love to hear from you, just so we can get a plan, so that, like, as organizations, especially if we're in a hiring freeze or hiring slow, this feels like the perfect time to spend our energy there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, again, first and foremost, I think it's really making sure you spend time to define what's driving your compensation philosophy. I've seen Mary Jantz of Alpha has a really great blog post about this. I know I shared the link with you. I don't know if you have somewhere you can
Yeah,
post
we
this.
get it in the chat. Yeah.
But it's a great resource to kind of think about, what are the salary ranges, and, like, how have we landed here in terms of, are we being market driven? Do we want to be specifically, like, performance driven? Are we looking at kind of salary bands based on levels like we do, or is it more of a, like, okay, maybe you're in a role and you're done really well, say a sales role, maybe there's some bonuses attached to that. And so really thinking about, philosophically, why are we compensating people the way that we are? Again, next, I would really emphasize the importance of defining career levels. Again, I think that's where you're looking at a band. It's something that, as far as bands themselves look like, we don't necessarily do at Brooklyn Data, but I know a lot of companies do, to kind of say this is, lower, mid, and high on a band.
And how wide would you recommend, like, a band within a level like that?
Yeah, it's going to vary by role, but I think there's what's reasonable? I guess is the question. Something unreasonable I've seen in an unnamed electric car company that may or may not be local to where I live. I've seen bands as wide as $50,000 to $250,000. I've seen even some, and again, another major tech company that posted something like $100,000 to $1 million range. Like, is that reasonable? No. And also, again, are you setting yourself up for success in a hiring process? If candidates are like, well, I'm clearly in that $100,000 to $1 million range and I want the $500,000 mark, that's probably not likely to be where that role is falling.
Yeah. Whereas, like, 10 to 20 probably would be a little more reasonable.
Yeah. So think of it as like a percentage of that role. What's going to be, if it starts at 100, maybe like a 20% range is reasonable, but like anything bigger than that might be, again, not setting anyone really up for success.
Yeah. We love that. We did have a question before you kind of go through the rest of like, what does it really take? Is it sufficient to simply state the beginning of a range, like 50K, or do we need to go beyond that? A lot of the legislation does say it needs to have a bottom and an end, and that's for hourly, whether it's $35 to $40 an hour or 50 to something, right? And again, candidates tend to get a little wary if they see a long range that doesn't feel reasonable. So when I think of what we're expecting to see in this space later, is I think there's going to be some test legislation and tests punishments that come down, specifically in New York City, as their legislation says reasonable range. Best faith effort of what the role is going to be. And I'm seeing a lot of like $200,000 ranges on some companies. And maybe that's the Band-Aid, right? Maybe that's the Band-Aid while you're getting your ducks in order internally, is to have some longer ranges. But I found like, yeah, bringing it down into like a $20,000 range is definitely where candidates are most excited and where there's going to be the most alignment. For everybody. Thanks for that question. If there's any others, we're just wrapping up here, but feel free to get your questions in. So can you finish a little bit, Rocío? I want to give you a chance to think through like, what are those other pieces that folks are going to want to make sure they allocate time towards?
Yeah. I think training is a big one for sure. I think it's something that, managers need to, and hiring managers and your recruiting team, whatever that looks like, just to get familiar with like, this is what we're hiring within. Again, you post a range, and even on the posting itself, like this is the range. And for this particular hire, we're aiming for someone here, which is, again, rationale for what that person might look like, skills wise or experience wise. Mm-hmm. Getting legal support to review, whether it's, external general counsel or someone that you have in-house. I think it's something that isn't going to fix itself overnight, but taking any step is the first step, and it will get you closer to where you need to be, particularly if you are affected by legislation. But even if you aren't, it's very likely that you may sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I would not be surprised if California, Colorado, and Washington's pieces turn into federal legislation at some point. I know a lot of other states have enacted a study to view what would this look like in their states as kind of the first step here. So this is definitely not going away, and probably going to get a little bit stronger over time. That as we kind of work internally. I think one other thing I'll add is that we're talking about being transparent to potential folks onto our team. I think being transparent internally with our current teams, saying this is what we're working on, and it might be a bumpy road, and we don't have all the answers, but we believe in the dream. We believe in bringing on folks to our team that we trust enough to be transparent with. We believe in paying any person that does the job the same amount of money, because we do want equity in our world and in our workplace specifically. Letting folks know what's going on there is always going to be better than just like kind of making pay decisions in a back dark room, which is I think what we all expect in the back of our minds. Even if we know, love, and trust our leader, there's just some amount of us that always thinks like, ooh, it just feels icky, right? Pay. And the more that we can engage in this conversation with our teammates internally, I think the better that rollout is going to look. Is there any other closing pieces, Rocío, that you wanted to leave folks with?
Yeah, I think, again, you've touched on this a bit in just what you were saying now, but, taking ownership, taking accountability, assessing your current state, painting a ideal future state, and then really mapping between those two and being able to say, here's where we are, here's where we want to be. And these are the steps we're going to take to get there. And really, especially in a startup environment, being able to communicate that with your team will, really take you far and more quickly, I think.
Awesome. Well, if folks want to get in touch with us, we're at hustlehunters.com. We're happy to help workshop through any of these new shifts, and we'd love to see you on future events. Thanks for showing up here today. And then, Rocío, if folks are interested in following you, learning more about Brooklyn Data, applying to Brooklyn Data, what's the best path for them there?
Yeah, they can check out our website, which is brooklyndata.co. And if you're interested, you're welcome to check out our career frameworks that we have publicly, actually outside of Brooklyn Data available. So it's brooklyndata.progressionapp.com. And again, you can look within that to see how we've built out our pay bands, our leveling, and within each role, you can say we have the actual salaries attached to them as well, which are pending a market refresh for 2023. So keep an eye for numbers there.
Awesome. Well, I'll get this link up on LinkedIn as well, so folks can see that, as well as the charts that we shared. So thank you, Rocío, for joining us today, and just for the rest of your team for putting in all this work and for being willing to, I guess, share your secrets so that we can all kind of join you in a more equitable future.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much. And I'm really excited to see how this shifts for really the entire ecosystem of hiring.
Awesome. Well, thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.